Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us for our, I've lost count, but for July's Back to Basics workshop, where we are going to be exploring Indigenous knowledge and climate justice. We are very, very thrilled that you've decided to take some time out of your day and spend your evening with us, and really just take it back to the basics of what Indigenous knowledge is, what climate justice is. The Back to Basics workshops are, for those who are joining us for the very first time, the Back to Basics workshops are workshops in which we go back to the very basics of these concepts. So we want to explore what Indigenous even means. How does it link to knowledge? And why is it relevant to climate justice? And if you're new to ACA, you'll know, you may have seen what we are calling dialogues. So after this, on Wednesday, we're going to have the ACA dialogue, which aims to take everything that we've learned today and marry it with reality. So the dialogue brings people with lived realities, academic knowledge, and other such things, brings them together, and then we all build a common understanding from that. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Before we start, maybe just to go over a few rules of engagement, because I think this is very important. The first would be, maybe please keep your mics muted unless there is a question that's been asked. That'd be really great. You're more than welcome to turn your videos on. But if at all possible, keeping them off would be really helpful for some people who might be in areas with low network. The first on the screen that you can see is to please raise your hand if you have a question or contribution. That would be really, really great. And if we can please keep questions where we open up the floor for questions or the contributions. Otherwise, you can use the chat. If your question really can't wait, you can pop it in the chat. You could either message us directly or you could message us privately. That is completely perfect. To all those who've just joined us, welcome to our Back to Basics workshop today, that we're going to be exploring Indigenous knowledge. Next is to please practice what we're calling the rule of two. That means to wait for two other people to please speak before you have a turn again. So if there were 4 facilitators, I would have spoken about the rules of engagement. I would have kept quiet until 2 other facilitators have spoken for me to then contribute again. Myself and Xoli will be practicing the rule of 2, although there's only 2 of us throughout the session, where we're going to be throwing the ball at each other, essentially. We practice that, and we feel that it allows everybody to either contribute or feel like they're part of the bigger group. If you are a lot more comfortable using your home language, please feel free to do that. And with that comes the challenge translating. So if there's anybody who can translate or understands that language, it would also be really, really helpful if you can nominate yourself and say, I understand that and would love to translate. Otherwise, using the chat or unmuting is also, you're welcome to do that. Next, I've just gone over the one where you are welcome to use the chat. That would have been the next one. And again, a warm welcome to everybody who's just been joining. I think we might be welcoming people throughout the session, which again is wonderful. So thank you again for taking time out of your day to spend with us today. Yeah, and so today we want to start by really understanding what Indigenous justice is, what climate justice is. We want to really go back. I mean, a lot of the times you hear people speaking about climate change, and a lot of other times you know that a lot of people don't know what climate change is. A lot of people don't know what climate justice is. A lot of people don't have a very good understanding of what justice in itself is. So what we're wanting to do today is really break this down and investigate the link between Indigenous knowledge, which Indigenous knowledge is knowledge that is, oh my goodness, I cannot find a different word for Indigenous, but it is, if you all can please keep muted, that would be wonderful. But Indigenous knowledge would be knowledge that is, it really cannot find the word. And I guess that is why Back to Basics workshops are very
exactly. And just so you know, like we will define it after the slide, so you don't have to stress about it.
And maybe just as an example, I speak Shona as my first language. So Indigenous knowledge would be knowledge that the Shona people hold and is theirs. And this could have been passed down generation to generation. It could be part of the traditions. And that is what Indigenous, maybe if you take it out of context, that would be what it is. And justice is the act of equalizing spaces, maybe even society. So if we speak of social justice, we're talking about making sure that everybody has access to resources, everybody has access to education, everybody has access to food and shelter, and all those fall under the umbrella term justice. And so this is what we're going to be exploring today. And then we also want to link climate justice, climate change, and Indigenous justice or Indigenous knowledge to some examples from the past and why we found ourselves where we are today, and why it is very, very important that we draw onto the experiences or the history that we hold. So thank you again for taking time out of your evening to spend with us, and we hope we learn as much as you do from us, from you.
Thank you, Mitchelle. Yeah, we thought to open up today's session by reading Lila Watson's words, quote, that says, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." I'm going to read that again, actually. And as I'm reading it, I just want you to really check in and see, as I'm reading these words, what's coming up for you, and using the chat, and maybe just to write some reflection or a word even, you know, that is resonating with you with this quote. So it says, "If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And for those who don't know Lila, she is an Aborigine from Australia, one of the Indigenous people. I mean, this quote has been used a lot, you know, in social justice and climate justice spaces, where it really speaks about people coming together in collaboration. And hence we're having this space today, as Mitchelle said, that we are just really taking things back to basics, you know, where we're going to deconstruct the knowledge. And yes, me and Mitchelle are holding the space, but we all want to co-create and learn from you as much as you would learn from us. We are not experts in some of these topics. And so, yeah, we just want to create a space where we can hear your views, your teachings, your learnings, so that we can learn and grow together. But also, like, this speaks a lot, you know, into what we're talking about today with Indigenous knowledge, where often it's left behind. And so what it means, you know, when we create spaces, when we bring that into the forefront and find ways of integrating that with the current systems that are existing now, you know, including technology, new ways of thinking, new ways of being. And I see that we have some reflections on the chat. I mean, Rosa said, "Radical listening is coming to my mind." Yes. Thank you, Rosa. So we're going to move into the next slide, Mitchelle. You see, Thomas says, same ideas that bring freedom, then we work together and not competition. Yes, Thomas from Zambia. Definitely creating spaces where we work together and collaborate and learn from each other. So what is Indigenous knowledge? Okay. And I know some of probably the knowledge might sound hypocritical, because maybe like we know some of these definitions, but we're just going to pretend that we don't know, because we're really taking things back to basics. So Indigenous knowledge is like it's a unique knowledge combined to a particular culture, society, like Mitchelle made that example with her being a Shona speaking, and so which means the ways that her great grandmothers or even mother were passed on to her. And so who she is at this moment comes from some of the knowledge or culture or tradition or belief systems from her parents, from her community or society. Also, it involves techniques and practices and caste tradition, beliefs in rural life, for example, like the agriculture, healthcare, food preparation, education, natural resources management. I mean, an example that comes into mind really, I was talking to an aunt today who is in the Eastern Cape and they just harvested maize. And she was explaining to me, the process of like harvesting and what's going to happen to it. And she was saying like some of the maize, they would use them currently to cook, but majority of it will be put in barrels and preserved, for later in the year when they have no food. Some of it will be crushed and made into maize, and some of it would be used as feed to the livestock. And so if you look all of that, I mean, those are the customs and traditions that have been passed on, from generations to generations in ways of really being with nature, being really close with nature and working in a very holistic way. And most of it, it's information based, it evolves around thousands and thousands of years. So as I said, a lot of the knowledge passed on from, our forefathers in how they basically used to live close to the land with nature and really living as one, with nature. And we are finding though currently that the indigenous knowledge is becoming more dynamic, it's changing, there's a lot of creativity involved, there's trial and errors because times are evolving also, as this knowledge is passed on, we are also like evolving it and just integrating like how the societies and communities are existing at this point of view. And so also there's a wealth, of communities established over time. I mean, speaking again to what been existing, and so all of that is then passed on from generations to a generation, and it's also adapted to local cultures and environment. I mean, my indigenous knowledge as a Xhosa woman will probably be very different, to Mitchelle, as a child who grew up in Zimbabwe, even though, the essence and the values might be the same, but there might be some differentiations because of just the local context of like where my village was, how my grandmother grew up, compared to how Mitchelle's grandmother was and just the community that she grew up in. Yeah. We're going to move on to the next slide. And if you have any questions or just need any clarity, please use the chat, but also if there's something that you feel like you want to add to this conversation, again, please raise your hand or use the chat. We welcome any comment, any feedback. Cool. So before we move on, we wanted to take space to involve everybody. And we're going to get into breakout rooms. But before we do that, we just want you to think of a memory, okay, or a story from your grandmother, grandparents, or an elder, in your community or family about like how they used to live back in the days, just think of like a 1-minute story or even like a memory. And we're going to take time to share those in pairs right now when we get into breakout rooms.
And maybe while we create those breakout rooms, we can start just brainstorming around that. so that when we come back, it's very easy for us to just pop it in.
Right, while we're waiting for the rest of people to come back to the main space, is there anyone who would like to share maybe a quick story or memory you have, from your elders or grandparents?
Okay, hello everyone, I'm from Uganda. I would like what my great parents used to tell me about in the African tradition, because before the coming of the whites, I'll talk about the worship. So in Africa, we had the way we worshipped our gods. I don't know if some of you are aware about that. Before the coming of the missionaries. So there is a way how they used to initiate doing ceremonies for the birth of the kid. There are certain occasions they used to do, and they had various types of gods, like god for rain, god for food. So they used to sacrifice gods to ask something. You get it? So that life, it was good, but anyway, most of it has gone away because like of the new civilization. But some of us still practice it because we can't let our tradition go to waste. You get it? So we try as much as we can to. That's what my great parents usually told me, that never let go of that. So that's the way of life they used to stay in. Yes, that's what I had to share. I don't know anyone can add up. Sorry if this seems like I don't know, because most of you don't
No,
believe
it's
it. I don't
perfect.
know.
It's perfect. Thank you so much for your sharing. We're just gonna keep moving because we very aware of time and we don't want to keep you all on this whole evening. But please use the chat to share your stories, your memories. We'd love to hear or read them out. Yeah. So we're gonna continue.
Okay, thank you. Maybe someone can take up next, okay, because of time.
Hello.
Okay. Hello.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay. My story is goes like that. I was growing up in
No, I think you are breaking up. I think
I
you
can take it
use
up.
the chat. Yeah.
I'm really
go
excited to share on this one. Okay,
Please,
so
Frida.
my parents shared this interesting story that still amazes me to this point. It's scary, but hey. So she talked about how they were led by chiefs in their communities or villages that they lived in, and how a chief had so much respect back then, and that when a chief dies, before the day that they are going to actually bury the chief, you have to stay indoors. So like there's no moving around. Everyone has to be indoors because people would disappear and people used to be deliberately killed to accompany the chief when he dies. So there used to be a target number of people. They call it in my local language Msamilo, which means the king's pillow. So it was a very big issue that when a king dies, then most definitely they are supposed to, when a king dies, then there are people that are supposed to get killed to just escort or help that king kind of go. Yeah, that's the story I wanted to share. Thanks.
Whoa, Frida. I hope that is
Sorry,
changed.
Hello.
I mean, that's definitely a part of the indigenous knowledge that we want to we don't want to carry forward. But it's such a fascinating and interesting stories. I mean, stories carry a lot of wisdom, carry a lot of history, and that's why we wanted to bring voice and just to hear, from all of you about the stories that we are caring about, just our ways of being, our indigenous knowledge from our elders and communities. So we're going to move on, but please share your stories on the chat. I would definitely love to read them. Yeah. Over to you, Michelle.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I already see that there are people who have been sharing in the chat. So thank you so much for doing that, Calvin. God knows. Again, just stressing that to please keep our mics on mute. It would really, really help, unless, of course, you're given the chance to speak or we pass the baton for you to speak. That'd be great. So I think now we have a little bit more of an understanding of what we're trying to get out of today's session. So we really want to get into maybe Indigenous knowledge more on the environmental aspect of things and environmental conservation, and not necessarily in the space where we're accompanying chiefs after their time on Earth has passed. But still very valid. And I think it really just helps us direct our conversation. So the next bit is now just going to talk about, if you can just give me a minute, there we are. Xoli, if you can please just confirm that the screen is visible and it says Indigenous knowledge and it intersects with climate justice. Perfect. So we know a little bit about climate change, and if we don't, we have these resources either on our website, or we've got past Back to Basics workshops that we have already had, so you can go ahead and look at those. So essentially what climate change is, it's the change of the environment, and why that's a problem is our environment is changing at such an alarming stage, and it's leaving a lot of people either homeless, without access to food, without access to resources, without access to education, without access to a lot of these things that really make us who we are. So they're losing livelihoods due to the impacts of climate change. And why that's important is because obviously when the climate changes at the rate that it's changing currently, it means that our environment is threatened. It also means that we are unable to get food from the land, or that we are unable to fully exercise or fully be present in the spaces that we would be. And so comes the term climate justice. Climate justice speaks to trying to make sure that we achieve justice in the environmental space. So that talks of making sure that we allow people to be able to adapt. That's another word that we're going to be exploring in the session. Adapt to the effects or the impacts of climate change. And what that would mean is looking at the sort of impacts or the sort of results that come from our environment degrading, or our environment simply being distracted. So if you look at things like deforestation, if you look at things like industrialization, if you look at things like the rate at which we are emitting greenhouse gases, which is affecting the ozone layer, which is making the planet warm up, which is making sea levels to rise, which is causing all of these different things, we see that there's an urgency to act. But we can't act without really knowing what the problem is or how to tackle it. And I think just about now I've sort of explained what climate justice is, and why it is so interlinked to Indigenous knowledge is, as we've learned just now when Xoli was explaining, it's in our context, at least, it speaks to the sort of knowledge that Indigenous groups hold. And the term Indigenous knowledge, or the Indigenous groups, or things around a group being Indigenous, really just came through when people of a specific region, we look at Africa, for instance, were displaced by people from another region. Specifically, we look at the West, who came and they colonized and they termed people Indigenous. But really what we're talking about is people who are original to a space. So Africans would be Indigenous to Africa. Indigenous knowledge in an African context would be African knowledge, right? And so the intersection between climate justice, or the link between climate justice and Indigenous knowledge, really says that we need to go back and look at Indigenous or African knowledge, or traditional African knowledge that had been used or employed in order to preserve the environment. Because what research suggests and even shows is that when we draw from Indigenous knowledge, we're able to adapt to the changing environment, but we're also able to make sure that the impacts of environmental degradation or climate change are lessened. So it means that it's less impactful. It means that where, for instance, in a region that passes close to a river, where Indigenous knowledge had said that you needed to raise the sort of wall that blocks people from the river when it rains. Things had been washed away in the past. And so people who are indigenous to that space had decided to draw onto their knowledge and their practices and build this wall. It means that now we can look back and say, we can do the same thing. We know that indigenous knowledge, a lot of the time, is either displaced or it's just out of reach due to practices that include oppression. So things like colonialism, specifically, if you look in an African context, people were not really allowed to practice their indigenous knowledge because they were forced to look to this idea of scientific knowledge is better than indigenous knowledge because of all these different dynamics that were at play. And with that, I think it just launches us to look at some differences between indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. And hopefully this brings it there. So maybe starting with scientific knowledge, we see that a lot of the times it's assumed as the best approximation. I'm just trying to make sure that we're still together because I just got a notification that my network is unstable. Can we still hear me well? Wonderful.
We can hear you,
So
Mitchelle.
perfect. So scientific knowledge is assumed to be the best approximation. So when you look at things like your weather app, right, that draws from scientific knowledge. I know one experience that I haven't shared is that I know some elders from my family can tell you that rain is coming just by smelling the air. And I'm not really sure what science is behind it, but like 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 times, it's true. And they're not using any scientific tools. They are looking at the position of the clouds. They're looking at the position of the sun. They are feeling the change in temperature and all of that stuff. Indigenous knowledge is assumed to be truth from practice, right? People have practiced it. They've seen that if they put a tomato seed in the soil, it grows into a tomato. It's also assumed to be sacred. It's regarded as so sacred really is just something that needs to be protected. In this case, we are trying to protect indigenous knowledge, draw to it, and make sure that we try and protect our environment as much as we can in the way that really best works for everybody. Why? Because indigenous practices and indigenous communities really understand that people work for the earth and the work does not work for them. The earth does not work for them. And what that even speaks to is this idea of extractivism and, profit over people, which is obviously an ideal that we're trying to break down when we look at the need to protect our environment. See that indigenous knowledge a lot of the times is passed down through storytelling. Like I've just mentioned, I've seen people tell me stories. I've seen people just practice it. And scientific knowledge a lot of the times is documented in formal resources, which brings us to the next point about how scientific knowledge is passed down through formal education. So I think most of us, if not all, have gone to school or some form of school. And that is one way that scientific knowledge is passed down. Indigenous knowledge, on the other hand, is passed down or you learn by doing or experiencing things, and then you draw from that. So you really have to be heavily into your environment for you to be deeply practicing indigenous knowledge. Next is, I think, seems to, I'm just going to skip through all of the others because I'm very aware of time, but I'm also very aware that we can all see what's on the screen, which is great. And just jump onto the second last point in that indigenous knowledge is felt to be subjective, where scientific knowledge is seen to be objective. And my stance on scientific knowledge being objective is subjective, because I don't always think that it's always true. But Indigenous knowledge being subjective obviously has to do with that specific area and those specific people who are coming from those specific conditions. So in that way, you can't always use Indigenous knowledge and adapt it to every single scenario. In the same sense, where scientific knowledge, you can't always apply it to the same scenario as well, because scenarios are very different. And yeah, there's just like a bit of a side-by-side of Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. And as we progress, we're going to be looking at why Indigenous knowledge is so important in us tackling climate change. And then I will hand over to Xoli to walk us through the advantages of specifically Indigenous knowledge.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, now we're going to look at advantages, especially, you know, when we're at the point where we are needing to act, you know, with what is happening in our climate, and just also like this huge reliance of science and really leaving behind the Indigenous knowledge. And one thing I wanted to say also, I mean, if you look at science versus Indigenous knowledge, what we've also like seen is that Indigenous knowledge really centers human beings, which is us. And I mean, we have seen, you know, with mitigation, how a lot of the solutions that are being put up front, especially with climate change, don't really center human beings, you know, and hence we have communities in the global south who are currently experiencing a lot of effects because a lot of the solutions are technology based or innovations that have not been tested, which also don't really centers like human beings. And so then there's this huge gap of really finding ways of bringing the Indigenous knowledge into the center, where we could look at ways of how we can center humans when we're designing our solution. So one of the advantages of really engaging with Indigenous knowledge is that there's no cost. If there are costs, they are very minimal. And it's also like readily available because it's again, it comes from generations and generations. Also another advantage is that Indigenous knowledge systems and technologies are found to be socially desirable and economically affordable, and they're also sustainable. It involves minimal risk to rural farmers and producers. And this speaks to the ecology. I mean, if you looking at ways our forefathers used to farm, they never really used to spend a lot of money now that the industrial agriculture is using, especially in terms of like, you know, preserving seeds, using pesticides. All of those things cost a lot of money. Whereas if we go back to how people in the villages do agriculture, there's not a lot of cost. You know, they found a ways of preserving their own seeds, and they use what is around them, you know, to grow their crops. And also another advantage is that Indigenous knowledge is widely believed to conserve resources. So as I said, you know, people, I mean, if we're looking at, again, back to the regions, people make use to what is around. You know, they don't go around seeking like what they don't have and spending money, especially if we're looking at like agriculture, but also like building homes. You know, homes were, even now, if you go back to your villages, they use wood, they use mud, whatever is around them, they just use the resources, but they also not just overusing them, they conserving them. And in some situations, modern science is not appropriate, and use of simple technologies and procedures is required. And hence, again, we should be going back into really looking at Indigenous knowledge, because not everything could be fixed with science, you know. It also provides a good basis for problem solving strategies to local communities. Yeah, I mean, we've seen like the example that Michelle made about, you know, the river crossing the village. Some people might say, okay, let's build a big wall, but the locals will know that if that is done, it's not going to be sufficient, or probably that wall will break down in a couple of months. And so the elders will then gather and really find ways of working around that issue, because they know the land. They know what resources to use that are easily accessible and available to them. Moving on to the next slide, Michelle.
Can you
So
see the
while I'm
screen?
Thank you, Michelle. While I'm waiting for the next slide, oh, I see the next slide there, but I also wanted to check the chat because I see that you guys have been writing such incredible contributions. Timbisa wrote that, you know, as an organic grower, I take a lot from my grandmother, how she used to do it. And I've learned indigenous ways for things like water retention, protection of the topsoil, abiding by the season and what they required or what they're saying, things they may not have English, and things that they may not have vocabulary for, but it preserves and protected the environment and guarantee good yields. I've applied most of these methods in my garden, and it has provided to help as per yields and we are getting now. Saving our water since we're depending on rainwater and protecting life that is crucial to our soil and living organism. I've been beneficial and also kinder to a mother of our environment. Yeah, definitely. I mean, we see how if we can really take some of these. I see your hand, Teresa, and we'll definitely give you, because we want to hear more, you know, about how you do that and how, yeah, that you bring it straight from you. And so another advantage is that Indigenous knowledge has always placed human beings at the core of preservation. You know, like I think I've explained that again, you know, all things such as plants, animals, water, soil are regarded as important and part of a bigger system. And also prioritizes the health of the humans without threatening or distracting the environment. I mean, I think we know, I mean, based on the examples and the stories that we've shared and what is currently being shared on the chat is that when we use some of these practices, they don't really harm the environment or the human beings, or even like little creatures, you know, on the soil that exist within those environment. Yeah. We're gonna move on to the next slide. Great. And I think before we move on, I want to give Timbisa just a moment to share if you're willing to like smile. So that means yes, you do want to. Please tell us, you know, how have you preserved this Indigenous knowledge and but also like integrating it into how you are on your own crops. Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you please repeat the last part of your question or your sentence?
Basically just sharing your what you have written on the chat. Yeah.
Oh yes. I just wanted to say, just going back to the dignity of how our African communities treated the environment and how they interacted with the environment, it was way more respectful, not only respectful, but we're finding out now that there's actually scientific names and things that are being promoted to try and preserve the environment with the climate crisis that is happening right now. And what I was saying in the chat was that even though my grandmother didn't have the vocabulary to say, oh, this is protecting the topsoil and all the organisms that are in the soil that help the food grow, even though she couldn't say that, oh, this is for water retention, we have to raise our beds so that we can protect the parts that we use for growing the plants. But those are the things that I'm now taking from and just remaining organic, using the hay, the grass from the wild lands that we use for grazing, using the rainwater and then protecting the soil to water retain, also to just protect the topsoil in making sure that we're getting more yield. There's a lot of information that we get from like the grown-ups that help us, the indigenous information that are very helpful to our modern society and could be very beneficial to our climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Timbisa. And that now will bring us into just like really practical examples of how some of this knowledge has been violated, or undermined within the climate space. And so over to you,
because,
Michelle.
Sorry.
Oh,
So
sorry, Timbisa.
It's just a lot of the times the time often is an hour and a
I
half.
know.
So we can always engage out of the space.
But we have Wednesday, which actually will be more a dialogue where you will definitely have more opportunity to share your stories, share your insights, share your learnings here.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start off by so this is a picture from somebody from the Maasai tribe. And I just want to read something. So I don't want to be the voice of the Kenyan people or the Maasai in particular, but I want to read something that came out of an interview with somebody who is an Indigenous leader or a leader of an Indigenous group. The question to them was, you are working to now bring Indigenous knowledge to the fight against climate change and wildlife extinction. What are some examples of that knowledge? Kemeren Ole Riamet, I hope I'm saying it right, that's the person's name. And this is their response to that question. Again, the question was, you are working now to bring Indigenous knowledge to the fight against climate change and wildlife extinction. What are some examples of that knowledge? And the response was, I'm privileged to belong to two worlds. I belong to the Indigenous world, but I also received a formal Western education. One lesson from the Indigenous community is that you take from nature only what you need. You don't overstock your fridge just to throw food in the dustbin. Another lesson is that nature takes care of us when we take care of it. We have a forest in our community that gives water to the only river that crosses the Masai Mara, which is a national reserve. The elders set the forest aside because it is a lifeline of people, of wildlife, of the livestock. So this is somebody who's obviously got the best of both worlds and is able to choose which of the knowledge can be implemented to fit a specific context, which is that comes from the knowledge that's been passed down by family members and other leaders in the tribe. The next question, it's just the two questions that I want to read out and then move into the next part. The next question that Benji Jones asked Kemeren was, the modern conservation movement is rooted in Western ways of knowing. When did you decide you wanted to be a part of that? So this is obviously carrying on from the fact that this person, Kemeren, had got educated from Indigenous communities, but also from the West. So more like formalized education in the way that we understand it. Kemeren says, I grew up in a thriving landscape, rich in biodiversity, and I was always connected to the land. When I was going to school as a young boy, I'd cross the stream every morning and arrive dripping wet. Water was always abundant. Then I started noticing things change. I saw that some birds were no more, such as the oxpecker. I can't remember the last time I heard of a honey guide. This river that used to flood has been reduced to a stream that a toddler can cross, barely wetting his feet. I saw that the landscape is almost crying. This is also speaking to the impacts and the effects of climate change. I started questioning what is happening and became aware of climate change. Even the community itself started noticing and saying dry months have stolen water from wet months, and they are not giving the water back. The Indigenous knowledge systems of weather forecasting became disrupted, and our livelihoods are ordered around the weather. And I think this is such an important, we'll share the link to this specific interview because we think that there's so much richness that's come from the knowledge that we get from Kemeren, but also just to properly outline to us the threat that climate change has to Indigenous communities, to Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous practices, and why it is so vital that we move toward a space that prioritizes climate justice while centering Indigenous people, because they are the most affected by the impacts of climate change. They are the most impacted by land degrading, by droughts. They are what we call frontline communities. And I think this is worth giving a little bit of a thought. Again, just being very aware of time, it's worth giving a little bit of thought toward what really happens to the communities that we come from when the climate starts to break down. What really happens to what we know as people, the things that have shaped our realities? What happens if I can no longer get water from the river that used to give me water? If I can no longer plant crops in July and now I have to wait for May the next year? What really happens to our ways of life? What happens to the systems that give us a sustenance? And what are the threats and what are causing these disruptions? And I think it's worth just thinking about for a minute. And while we think about that, I invite everybody who has access, and if you don't, reach out to us and we'll assist you with that. But we invite everybody who's here to look into the case study or the case of the Maasai people, the plight that they're currently facing. I don't want to give too much away. I just want us to have 1 minute of just thinking about what I've just said around Indigenous knowledge and the threat that Indigenous people face due to the impact of climate change. So just 1 minute and then we'll resume. There's also a few comments and I'll just read one of them. This is a great conversation and I'm learning a lot from everyone here. I have lots of stories that I relate to as someone who grew up in a rural area and depending highly on natural resources. I must say though that things have changed a bit. Life is different. People are more occupied with work in a corporate sense and barely have time to go back to the old ways. We're always looking for easier and more convenient ways to do things. And unfortunately, we're unaware of the damages we are causing. This is from Patiswa. Thank you, Patiswa, for sharing that. To think about just what I've spoken about in the interview that I shared. And I just want us to, we'll share the presentation and some of the links mentioned here. We'll put them in an email and then we'll share a follow-up. Just reading another comment and then moving on. This is from Sokosi. My grandma used to tell me that the advancement of technology, that through the advancement of technology, things will get destroyed. In the past, they believed in indigenous seed varieties, unlike this time where hybrid seeds have taken place and the use of inorganic ways of farming, which have degraded the soil. Governments have supported the introduction of hybrid seed instead of promoting and supporting indigenous knowledge. Sokosi is an award-winning journalist in reporting on issues of climate change, and according to what he has discovered, or they have discovered, poverty has also contributed negatively to the climate change, as humans contributed negatively through charcoal burning, deforestation, or farming purposes, burning of bushes in search of mouses and other animals, especially in rural areas. Oh gosh, I can see really powerful contributions and I don't want to sit here reading all of them. But Blessing says, climate change has great impact to the local people who contribute less than industrialized people who contribute more. And then the last one is Tuoleni, who says, I can vividly remember well my grandmother telling me how they survived drought using local fruits and seeds in order to reach the next season. Water was precious and one has to take care of the water source. I think this also all speaks to how we as humans actually are taken care of by the environment instead of us having to take more than we need. Us also speaks to the importance of preserving the environments that we come from. And I think I will leave it there. And again, just um, inviting people to look a little bit more into the Maasai tribe and the current problems that they're being faced that they're being faced with, like for instance, having to give up their nomadic lifestyles due to climate change. Chloe, over to you, because I will keep reading all of these comments.
I know, it's so tempting. Yeah, we also just wanted to highlight another case study. Michelle, if you can move to the next slide. I mean, I won't go in detail to this case study, just looking at time. But I mean, these are South African Indigenous people, the Khoisan, who have been fighting the right to a land that was taken from them for decades. I mean, over like 500 years ago, the South African Indigenous Khoisan population fought off the Portuguese attack in one of the first attempt and most successful colonial battles in Africa. But today we see, I mean, some of the descendants Khoisan who are currently also fighting the US retail giant Amazon, who is attempting to build the African headquarters on the same land in Cape Town that they've been fighting for or fought for over a decade. And yeah, it's just, I mean, it highlights how really a lot of the systems that are existing really undermine the Indigenous people and the Indigenous knowledge. And I really like what, there was a comment, I forgot the name, I think someone that says, you know, times are moving, you know, like we're living in different times where we live in the cities. So where's the place of this Indigenous knowledge? And I think that's a very fundamental question that we should be asking ourselves. So, you know, as we move on and progress in life, how are we how are we carrying forward some of these learnings and teachings, and where is their place? And so I totally don't believe that it is no space for them, especially you know, if you're looking at now the words like sustainability, where they've been made to be new ways of being, whereas like if you again going back to our old ways of being, this is how we used to be, you know, this is how we used to live. Now all of these commercials or big companies, they're commercializing these words, you know, and selling them back to us to like, oh, live a green lifestyle. But what does it really mean? You know, if your whole entire life you've been that, like your family and your great grandmothers have lived that way. So it's something that we should really think about carefully, you know, as we now moving on with the times, and really asking ourselves, like, are we selling our knowledge, you know, to the West? Are we actually buying our knowledge, something that we know that lives within us, that is truly like engraved in our beings, in our bones? Or are we just really going to humble ourselves and go back, you know, to our Indigenous knowledge and really dig deep, find those knowledge and speak to our elders, you know, so that we can continue finding ways of integrating that knowledge in today. Yeah. I see Tulo has a comment that says, ideally, the political system in the region doesn't allow local people to practice Indigenous knowledge to the fullest. And this is a real threat. Yeah, definitely. And here on this slide is really like an example how these two spheres, like the Indigenous knowledge and the climate governance, can really meet each other. Because one thing that for that to happen in that political system is that we need to decentralize that power, you know, because we cannot embed Indigenous knowledge with the systems that are currently existing. And the only way to do it is to really like decentralizing and finding ways of Indigenous people influencing policies, and really sitting on those big meetings and sharing their knowledge. And how to do that is really them finding their autonomy, you know, of speaking and sharing their stories, sharing their knowledge. I know Timbisa spoke about, you know, how the elders don't have the vocab, but we have that knowledge. So we should be the one that are working closely with them and helping them to write some of this knowledge down so that it's not lost. So in that way, it's also helping them to build that autonomy and growing and just finding ways of spreading that knowledge. And another way is accountability. We really need to find ways of holding our politicians and government accountable in ways that they're implementing and really mitigating the climate change. And then within that is transparency, because you can't hold somebody accountable with something that you don't know. And I'm not going to go through all of them, just again, looking at time. Yeah, and I think one big thing in this system is inclusion. Again, finding ways of including the Indigenous people into those big corporation and policymakers. Yeah. And so now we're going to go back, not back, forward, actually, into looking at Indigenous knowledge and adaptation. Yeah. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Xoli. And what I love about the session that we're getting into now is I saw a few comments that were pointing toward this part, and I am so excited. I don't think you guys can tell, but Wambuye says it's interesting that it's our grandmothers mostly mentioned who carried this knowledge and not our grandfather. I think that is very interesting, and I think we need to have a separate session just unpacking why that is. But again, an invitation to look into that. Sophia says, my grandmother catches rainwater and puts it in salt to wash the white cloths and keeps that white, which is awesome. Takondwa says, in terms of preservation stories, from my great grandfather. There we go. This is wonderful. In terms of preservation stories, from my great grandfather was passed down on the need to preserve trees because they play a part in rainfall creation. We were told as kids that trees are a habitat for ancestral spirits. Scary, right? But that in a way, this helped us respect these trees to the point where either on the farmyard or Peru urban settlements, we rarely cut down trees, even if they're small. And we always plant more so that they get more rainfall, which can be turned as climate action in a way. Absolutely. All in all, this is a great interaction. Scientific knowledge should be applied to improve Indigenous ways of conservation and climate action instead of replacing it. And I feel, and vice versa, Indigenous knowledge should be applied to improve scientific ways of preservation and climate action. So there's really a give and take, because we firmly believe that there is a place for all of this. The challenge is finding out how both can really just exist in a harmonious way that does not seek to draw one down or say that this one is more important, which is incredible. Here's another one from Grace. My grandmother could tell the start of rains by observing the trees around our home. It was quite interesting waiting for her prediction to come to pass. Actually, chances were very high. My mom could start planting seeds in the field 3 days prior to the start of rains, and it was working, which is, again, incredible. That we have such powerful examples of how Indigenous knowledge has been used to live in harmony with the environment. Another one is I learned from my grandmother also to teach us if there's a strain on the nap of the child, you wet the nappy soak with sunlight soil, hang in the sun for a while or two, and then wash the stain and see if it's out. So this is all just sharing Indigenous knowledge, and we think that's really, really interesting. Henry and Patso say, I think we also need to overcome the present generation by discussing with them how we can overcome climate change using different ways. For example, open systems that could allow people to plant trees from a community level, like primary schools, just to keep the generation on and on.
We've lost you there for a bit, Michelle. Sorry, but you.
Oh, did you? Am I back? Wonderful. I was just reading some of the comments, which are interesting. I was just reading some comments which are interesting, and I think it would do us some good to look back and see what some of those sharings are. And I think what we've done throughout the session is just look at the importance of Indigenous knowledge and why we should draw onto Indigenous knowledge when we design whatever it is we're going to design, or when we look at issues around climate change, environmental conservation, because it is the understanding that we can't have the one without the other. But to truly reach a point where you can say, we have reached climate justice, we need to realize that Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge need to be centered. So you cannot try and design a solution that combats climate change, for instance, for an Indigenous community, using knowledge and practices that are completely out of context for that specific community. And that's where centering Indigenous peoples and their practices really comes into play. So you more or less start to co-create solutions to say, scientifically, this is what we've seen to work. How does this apply in the Indigenous space? And I think that's very, very important. There's also a question, how can we make Indigenous and scientific practices coexist? And this is a very important question, because what we're going to do on Wednesday is we're going to have people who are Indigenous practitioners who in some instances have also gone through the Western education, which means that they've got the formalized scientific knowledge as well. And they are going to be telling us and showing us how we can make Indigenous and scientific practices coexist. So if you haven't already, please do sign up to that, sign up to Wednesday's dialogue. It's going to be exploring exactly that. And I am aware that it's exactly 7 o'clock. So I don't know if you allow us to do this. We don't want to go over time, but if we can just ask for 5 minutes of your time so that we can just wrap up what we've done today. And really just thank you for your participation throughout the session, because it really was meaningful. And the engagement was incredible. So thank you so much for taking that time out. What we will do is we're going to compile some resources that we're going to send through. We have resources around climate justice that already exist. We're going to put that together with this presentation and send it via email so that you can really have somewhere to go back to. But you can also always reach out to us whenever you have a question or whenever you really just want to chat. And Xoli, I think we've sort of reached that point in our presentation or in this workshop where we sadly have to now work towards saying goodbye for now, because it's my hope that we see each other again on Wednesday. Xoli?
Yes, I know. I mean, time is always against us, but I think, as Michelle said, that this conversation will continue definitely on Wednesday, where we'll bring in the experts, people who are doing this work, who have degrees, who lives in the cities, and finding ways of integrating Indigenous knowledge in their daily lives or in their work. So please join in the webinar on Wednesday. And I see that there's somebody with a hand up. I'm thinking maybe let's just take 2 more minutes to, if you really have a burning question or you have a comment or have something to say, let's just take 2 more minutes.
Maybe before we open up the floor, I just want to answer some few questions that are in the chat. One is, where do we get the link for Wednesday's workshop? So if you go on our social media, on our Instagram specifically, or on our Facebook or on our Twitter. I'm guessing that you saw us via Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. You'll find that there's also a link to, in the same way that you followed the link to join today's session, there'll be one that also speaks, it specifically says ACA Dialogue, so you can sign up there. Alternatively, you can pop us an email if you can't find it and say, please send me the link, and we will make sure that you have it. For data reimbursements, same thing, please do get in touch. Use the name that you've used in the session, please, in your inquiry, because if you give us a different name, unfortunately, we won't be able to tell whether or not you've attended. And also, maybe just to put it out there, if you can just give us 3 days to a week to sort out data reimbursements, because we are dealing across different countries, across the African continent. So if you can please just be a little bit patient with us. Again, please pop us an email around data reimbursements, use your name that you've used in the session. And I think now we can open up the floor for burning questions.
Just to add one more thing on that, Michelle, is also to please include your network. Because I mean, numbers vary. So please, if you're using M2N, whatever network you're using, please to include that, because that is vital in us reimbursing your data. Yeah. Yeah, I see that it's almost 5 past. Again, just to take one comment. Yeah, I'm sure there's so much. I mean, we could stay here the whole evening and continue with this conversation, but also we know that you guys have lives that you need to get back to. So I'm just going to take one comment because I see this person, Shame, has had their hand up for quite some time. It's 1D2DS. There's no name. And it would be great, again, if you could please rename yourself as the name that you've used to register so that we can track who has attended the session. So the floor is yours, 1D2DS. Okay. All right. I think let's leave it at that. Actually, let's leave it at that because we don't want to keep you for the whole evening, even though we would love to. And just a big thank you. Oh, I see Frida has hand up. Go ahead, Frida, before we close.
All right. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, and it opened up my mind to maybe things that I knew but never really paid much attention to say they mattered. Yeah, it was a very educative session. So thank you very much. I just wanted clarity on the data reimbursement. If there any kind of link will be sent directly to our email, how to go about it on your part. I think you explained that we have to indicate our network, but I really didn't understand what provision is going to be used and what will be required on our end if a link will be sent at all to our emails.
Yeah, I think as Michelle has said that we will be following up. And so, but you can also just reply to the email that you received with the Zoom link, your name, the name that you've used to register, but also including your network. And I think Michelle also said that we, because there's a lot of people that we're dealing with and our team is very small, promise it will grow soon. But at this moment, we're a very small team, juggling, wearing different hats, you know, doing different roles. And so it does sometimes take a long time. It also, considering that we are dealing with different networks, different countries, we haven't found a very swift technology, you know, that just makes this very easy. And I guess maybe that's an appeal, you know, if you come from an organization that distribute data across Africa, and please share the network or the system that you're using to make that easier. But for now, it just will require a day or two for that to happen, but it will definitely happen. Yeah, you will be reimbursed for your data.
I think that maybe we can.
Great.
Yeah, what you were about to say. I was gonna say the same thing. That maybe now we can just properly come to a close, and then just really thank you guys for being wonderful, for being really, really great. You guys were incredible today. The engagement was really amazing, and we look forward to seeing you this coming Wednesday. So today's Monday, this is going to be Tuesday. On Wednesday, we're having our dialogue. So on the 27th of July, where you'll get an opportunity to interact with experts or Indigenous people in the field, and really even ask the questions that you need to ask. Remember to please pop us an email around data reimbursements and other such things. It'd be really, really helpful. And the name you use to register for the session, otherwise we will not find you. So please. We are also on all social media, including Facebook, including YouTube. So this video will go up on YouTube. If you have any questions, any concerns, again, please do email us. But we also have what we're calling the Activist Network, and you're more than welcome to come and become a part of this African Climate Alliance Activist Network. You can sign up again via email, or you can go to Facebook, you can sign up via there, or you can go to our website, you're able to sign up. We also have groups, and our network is growing. And if you really would love to get in touch with us, I am going to put the email in the chat just one more time so everybody has it. team@African Climate Alliance.org. team@AfricanClimateAlliance.org. That's our email address. You could also get in touch with us via social media, because we understand that's sometimes easier. So via Instagram, via Facebook, via Twitter, you can pop us a message and we will respond. And with that, really, thank you again for being part of the session and staying till 7:10. I'll give last words to Xoli, and then we'll call it a close, and hope that you guys have a wonderful evening.